Hello, everyone, and welcome to our talk today on boosting cyber resilience, black swans, gray rhinos, and coordinated response. My name is Beth Dunphy, and I'm the business unit CISO and privacy leader for IBM Security. Thank you for joining me today. In today's talk, we'll discuss the menagerie of crisis and the threats we must consider when planning for cyber resilience. We'll also discuss steps that each of you can take to improve the cyber resilience of your organizations. And lastly, we'll cover the importance of ongoing evaluation and measurements to demonstrate the readiness and continuous improvement of your programs. So let's dive in. Cyber resilience refers to an organization's ability to keep operating when cyber attacks or other adverse events affecting our IT systems occur. We can prevent, detect, contain, and recover from a myriad of serious threats against our data, applications, and IT infrastructure. But building and maintaining cyber resilience is an imperative in the survival of the business in today's digitized and highly interconnected world. A recent study from the US Small Business Administration shared that 90% of small businesses will fail in less than a year after a disaster if they don't recover in the first 5 days. And we've seen one of the most critical success criteria for recovering after a disaster is having a response plan. But in a recent study that IBM and the Ponemon Institute did on cyber resilience, we found that only 26% of enterprises have an enterprise-wide incident response plan. And when you consider the financial impacts of an IT outage on a large enterprise, they can be devastating. The average cost of an outage for a large enterprise is over $11,000 a minute. And considering more than half of large enterprises have indicated that they experienced outages of more than 8 hours, we quickly arrive at a cost of over $5.5 million per 8-hour outage. This is enough to shutter the doors on many companies. Similarly, if we look at the cost of a data breach, it can be just as significant of an impact on an organization. In our 2020 cost of a data breach study, we found that the average global cost of a data breach was $3.86 million, which surprisingly represents a 1.5% decline from our 2019 report, but it's still too high. Costs were much lower for some of the more mature companies, but they were much higher for organizations that lagged in areas such as security automation and established incident response processes. We saw that the average time to detect and contain a breach was 280 days, and the cost of responding and containing to the breaches goes up day for day. Compromised credentials and cloud misconfigurations led the way in malicious breaches in the responses to that study. We saw that 19% of those malicious breaches were caused by compromised credentials, another 19% by cloud misconfiguration, and 16% due to vulnerabilities in third-party software. With such significant material impacts and costs to both IT downtime and data breaches, our businesses must take action. We cannot afford to wait. We have to prepare so that we can minimize the impact of these crises on our organizations. So we'll spend the next few minutes discussing different types of threats that our organizations must prepare for. In his 2007 book, Fooled by Randomness, Nicola Nassim Taleb, who's a finance professor and former Wall Street trader, coined the term black swan. He described a black swan as something so improbable, so uncertain, that it's unimaginable and it often has extreme impact. And after the black swan event, many might try to say that it was indeed predictable, that it was explainable, and they may attempt to rationalize its causes. This is because black swan events are highly subject to hindsight bias, and unfortunately, they're all too often used as a scapegoat or an excuse for failing to plan or failing to take action. You might hear people say, oh, we never imagined that would happen, and no one ever saw that coming. And not all black swans are crisis events, and not all crisis events are black swans. We also find that black swans can be positive events too. But for our purposes here today, we're going to largely equate them with a crisis scenario. And when I consider how to best characterize a black swan, this quote by John Maynard Keynes nicely puts it into perspective. He says, by uncertain knowledge, let me explain. About these matters, there's no scientific basis on which to form any calculable probability. So how do we identify a black swan when we cannot predict the unpredictable? And we certainly can't prevent it. So let's look at some examples of what might be considered a black swan event. Black swans are generally the inspiration for movies, literature, and crisis planning. They'll span from massive geological weather events to financial crisis to man-made disasters. You might consider a volcano erupting and causing localized disasters as part of your planning. That's not a black swan. But perhaps a supervolcano that erupts in Yellowstone Park and wipes out the entire Northwest of the United States, that may well be one. The bursting of the dot-com bubble in the early 2000s is often characterized as a black swan because who could have predicted the NASDAQ composite would lose 78% of its value with over 1 trillion in losses due to the crash of a few internet companies. Currently, there's also a lot of focus on the electrical power grid, and many scholars, industry experts, and even security professionals like ourselves are exploring possible black swans that could affect the US power grid. They say that a power blackout in a city or a region would not be a black swan. We should be preparing for those. But the experts do warn us they see 3 types of black swans to our power grid, be it solar flares, electromagnetic pulse, and cyber threats. Although I would argue in this day and age, it's hard to consider a cyber threat against any type of IT system or operational technology to be a black swan. While we do need to plan for these major unexpected black swan events, we also need to plan for the more obvious threats that are right in front of us and ready to charge. So we need to spot the gray rhinos that are all around us. But how do we do that? Some may postulate that a black swan event is really just made up of a crash of gray rhinos that result in more extreme or unforeseen impacts. In her 2013 book, Michelle Wucker coined the term gray rhino. She described gray rhinos as those events that are highly probable, they're obvious, they're visible, they're coming right at you with large potential impact and highly probable consequences. People talk about gray rhinos because they're all around us. They're obvious enough that a reasonable person can see them coming, but often they don't. And we can anticipate their outcomes and their impacts. Organizations have to identify their own gray rhinos and they need to prepare for their impact. It's better to plan and prepare to reduce the impact for when the inevitable eventuality of a gray rhino occurs. Another quote I like here is from Theodore Roosevelt. And he says, in any moment of decision, the best thing you can do is the right thing. The next best is the wrong thing. And the worst thing you can do is nothing. The worst thing you can do is nothing when it comes to gray rhinos and planning for a crisis. Behind every black swan is a crash of gray rhinos. And we talked about some of those scenarios just a moment ago. What you may be wondering is, what about COVID-19? Is COVID-19 a black swan or a gray rhino? COVID-19, by many accounts, is not a black swan. Pandemics have been all around us for many years in history, dating back to the Black Plague, even before that, truly. And as we look closer, the 1918 flu pandemic, the yellow fever outbreak that was in the late 1700s in the US, we have many examples of our society being affected by a pandemic or an epidemic of a different form. If you look back to Taleb, who I mentioned about the black swan, he actually published an article back in March where he called COVID-19 a white swan, not a black swan. He said this is something so predictable and probable that it would take place with great certainty. And in many ways, I'd suggest that COVID-19 was actually a gray rhino. We've heard from many epidemiologists and other healthcare leaders who are what we will call corporate Cassandras. I'll get to those in a minute. That there has been a warning and looming global pandemic for years. We've heard from experts like Larry Brilliant, Lori Garrett, and Bill Gates, even his famous 2015 TED Talk, where he's quoted for warning of a looming global pandemic crisis and that we needed to take action to prepare. So I'll take you back to my prior question. Do you think COVID-19 is a gray rhino or a black swan? I think only time and history will tell, but let's continue. So I'll tell you, crisis is closer than it appears. We see that gray rhinos often hang out with other animals in this menagerie of crises. We see them hanging out with the evil monkeys and the ostrich with their head in the sand. We also see them hanging out with the elephant in the room. These elephants in the room are different from rhinos. By definition, no one says or does anything about these elephants. They act almost as if the elephant will remain stationary. There will be no action due to our lack of attention on it, and that it's not there ready to charge and create a catastrophe if given the opportunity. So I mentioned Cassandra's before, and let's spend just a moment on what I meant by that. In their book, Warnings, Finding Cassandras to Stop Catastrophes, Richard Clark and R.P. Eddy describe the concept of a Cassandra. And so you may be asking yourself by now, who is Cassandra? Why do I care? Well, she was the princess of Troy in Greek mythology, and she was cursed by the god Apollo to be able to see into the future, and was ridiculed and disbelieved by those she tried to warn of impending disaster. Cassandras can be found all across our organizations. They're often technical experts who bring forward their concerns backed by real data, to which their peers and management often will ignore. Cassandras may be that quirky team member, the wild duck, or the questioners who are on the fringes of our team. And as security leaders, we have to figure out, are they Chicken Little, or are they a Cassandra with a real and valid warning that requires our attention and action? One of the most notable Cassandras in our present time, I mentioned a moment ago, is Lori Garrett. She not only predicted global pandemic, but she also predicted the global impact of HIV. Garrett is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. She's not a health expert, but she was able to look at the publicly available data and see the gray rhino health threats, which were ready to crash into society and disrupt our businesses. She and other experts have tried to warn us over and over again, but to no avail. So let's switch gears here just for a minute. And I've talked about the doom and the gloom of these different crises scenarios that we need to consider. But what can we do about it? What can we do to take control and take action? We're going to talk about ways that we can prepare to be successful and not be a statistic of failed business when crisis does occur. Over the next few minutes, I'll talk about building our dream team and who to include in our planning. We'll also talk about the types of planning and automation that your organization should have in order to improve its cyber resilience. We'll talk about the importance of planning ahead to communicate, not just communicating. And finally, as I promised, a brief discussion on testing and measurement. So first, we're going to create our dream team. We're going to have one team with one goal. And in order to plan, you need to pull together the right stakeholders from those teams who can not only help to identify the risks to your organization, but also build the responses to them. Planning can't be done in a vacuum by the IT or the security team alone. Planning and response teams need to include business stakeholders from key business functions, as well as corporate functions like HR, legal, corporate communications, and marketing. They will provide the business context that the technical teams need in order to plan and prioritize responses during a business crisis. Likewise, the technical and security teams have different groups that are often underrepresented in their response activities, be it business continuity or crisis response planning. It's not just the IT operations team who will do it all on their own. They may need to consider adding their help desk or support team members, or maybe their application development team needs to be included to be able to be called on for their expertise when incident response or disaster recovery for that application isn't going as planned. Another often overlooked set of stakeholders are our suppliers and the important partners we have across our supply chain. We may find that we have these third parties who are critical to the delivery of certain business operations and applications. So we have to consider the end-to-end business team, not just those in-house. By including a diverse team of both technical and business leaders, we will yield far superior outcomes in our planning and our response. It's important that we bring together our business continuity and our security incident response teams, because in today's threat landscape, a cyber event is every bit as likely to be the source of a disaster as a physical real-world event, especially when we consider ransomware. Bringing together our security incident response and our business continuity teams early and often will improve security posture sooner than if they work together for the very first time during a massive security incident. I'll even take it a step further. Organizations with stronger cyber resilience recognize that security and privacy go hand in hand. Business and technology go hand in hand. As security leaders, we have to eliminate these silos and encourage a culture of collaboration to more effectively respond to data breaches. We need to build one team with one goal. So now that we have our dream team assembled, we need to get them to work in planning and in automating our response. So you need to plan your work and work your plan. A defensive playbook is a necessity for success in any endeavor, whether it's a football team stopping the ball or a cybersecurity team stopping threats from disrupting their business. Defining a plan and practicing it in advance is vital to its success. Despite improvements year to year in that cyber resilience report that I mentioned, we still see a vast majority of organizations, nearly 3/4, are not fully prepared to respond to cyber threats, either because they have no plan, they have ad hoc plans, or their plans are applied inconsistently across their business. And if we look further, business continuity planning will help us to prioritize the most critical resources and evaluate a variety of threat scenarios, again, including cyber threats, to ensure that we can continue after a disaster. We expect our organizations to have disaster recovery plans, and these need to be well thought out in how to recover critical resources, locations, and personnel in different types of threat situations. Not every application or process can be considered critical to a business, so some consideration to prioritization or business continuity planning tiers is also important to consider as you put together your plans. And last but not least, your security incident response and disaster recovery plans are also equally important. And surprisingly, they may have many commonalities between one another, especially when we're considering how to recover critical business systems and applications after a cyber disaster. Plans are going to vary from organization to organization, but the important part here is that you need to tailor them based on the specific dynamics to your industry, your geography, and most importantly, your technology stack. Dynamics of your technology stack, whether it's in a legacy data center or a more modern cloud-based solution, is going to be one of the biggest drivers in your organization's business continuity planning and their cyber resilience preparedness. And regardless of your unique circumstances, I would recommend that there are 5 different types of meta scenarios you should be considering when driving your organization's cyber resilience planning. First is thinking about when your workplace is unavailable. Many of us have experienced that this year with COVID-19, and we were not able to work in our normal office locations. The second is workforce that's unavailable. And by this, I mean generally more than half of your staff are unable to come in and perform their roles, whether it's remote or in the office, but that your workforce itself is not available to execute their job. The third scenario, this is the one almost all of us instantly think of. It's our IT outages. How are we ensuring that our IT will remain available and resilient? A fourth scenario that many organizations plan for, but equally many don't, is a regional disaster. This may be a combination of the first 3 scenarios, and it tends to be restricted to a local region or country. And last but not least is a cyber disaster. A cyber event could serve as the catalyst for any one of those scenarios, or it may serve to magnify the impacts of those scenarios on the organization. Again, in the cyber resilience study, we saw that only 17% of those respondents indicated that they had run books for different type of cyber threats. That's quite alarming, especially if we consider the gray rhino scenario of a cyber threat, and in particular ransomware. McAfee recently published a statistic saying that year to year from 2019 to 2020, they saw 118% year-to-year increase in ransomware as a top attack tactic. So if that's the case, then why do only 45% of organizations that responded to our resilience survey indicate that they even have a ransomware response plan? Only 45%. So each of these meta scenarios I described have discrete runbooks. They need to be particular to your organization, your systems, the threats that will likely affect you and your organization, and be targeted, and they need to be detailed so anyone who wants to execute that crisis response is able to easily step in and follow them, follow the recovery procedures, and then the goal is that they're so well defined that you're able to even ideally automate them. So one of the reasons we automate is to reduce complexity, but it also helps to increase our resiliency. When encountering threats to our business, such as cyber threats, it's a natural response for organizations or for any of us to want to just add more tools to our arsenal. We're going to repel attackers from every angle with every different tool in our toolkit. However, more is not always better. In one of our recent studies, we found that on the average, an organization has more than 45 security tools to interact with. So these additional tools mean more dashboards to monitor, more alerts to vet, more time to spend responding to an incident. Really, it all says that this is more complex, and it actually can make our organizations worse at responding to a cyber crisis or security incident. In the cyber resilience study, we saw that just over half, 52% of the respondents, though, did say that they improved their cyber resilience through the use of cloud services. And when we separate out high performers, we saw that actually jumped up to 63%. So nearly 2/3 cited the use of cloud services as one of the main reasons they were able to improve their cyber resilience posture. This is largely due to cloud-based solutions tending to be more resilient by design. They tend to have recovery automation already built into the platform and other automation and orchestration tools available on the cloud platforms that help to increase the resiliency, the redundancy, the availability of our applications and systems. But these tools, again, create complexity. And to reduce complexity, we need to embrace interoperability. By embracing interoperability, we're going to increase our visibility of potential threats that may affect our organization. And as we navigate these complex security and technology environments, the most effective teams are those that leverage interoperability to increase their visibility across their tool sets and data to help prevent, detect, contain, and respond to attacks. Approaches that streamline your incident response workflows will help to increase the productivity of your security operations center, your IT operations teams, and other teams that are critical to the rapid response and recovery in your organization when disaster occurs. Further, we see technologies such as analytics, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, when coupled with cloud services, are even further reasons why organizations indicated they were able to improve their cyber resilience. In particular, incident response orchestration and automation was able to improve operational efficiencies and reduce team churn by freeing up our security response teams and giving them extra time to focus on the high value tasks that they needed to investigate and respond when crisis strikes. And in the midst of crisis, you need to communicate. But if you don't prepare your communications in advance, then you're likely to find those lacking, and that's going to hamper your crisis response efforts. So let's talk a minute about how we can improve our communications during crisis. So many organizations put a lot of time in planning. We build our dream teams, we write our documents, but as part of that, very few organizations actually take time to prepare their crisis communications in advance. Experience demonstrates that The organizational leadership that does not understand, in the absence of adequate internal and external communications, that their operational response processes will break down. Stakeholders are not going to know what is happening, and they're quickly going to become confused, angry, or even react negatively. Their organizations may be perceived as inept and, at best, negligent at the worst. The length of time that it requires to bring full resolution to an issue is going to be elongated, often dramatically, because of a failure to communicate. And the impact to the financial and reputational bottom line of an organization during crisis can be even more severe. So in short, crisis communications is one of the most important factors that will help determine how your organization weathers the storm of a disaster. Organizations should take a few steps to improve the preparation of their communications before crisis strikes. First, as I mentioned, engage your corporate communications, public relations, or marketing teams as part of your planning efforts. These groups will help you identify who are the authorized internal and external spokespersons and who that will be able to speak on behalf of your organization during a crisis. And they may even provide spokesperson training to help that person communicate even more effectively. You also want to draft your template communications ahead of time. Be specific and concise when writing them. You can leave them a little fill in the blank, but you want to prepare them in advance. Making them specific to different threat scenarios will make them even more impactful and reusable across variations of those threat scenarios, because we know a threat never plays out the same in the real world as it did on paper. And we need to understand what types of communications are going to be required for different audiences in different threat scenarios. Understanding in advance what employees will need to know versus what you may communicate to the press, shareholders, or your customers can help make your crisis response go more smoothly. Do you want your employees to show up at work one day and have a paper taped to the glass of the front door saying, "IT outage, sorry, go home"? Or do you want to have a more thought out and well-executed communications plan? And on that note, lastly, you need to prepare your communications logistics. Consider which channels you're going to use and how often that you're going to plan to communicate updates. Whether you choose email, website updates, social media updates, or some combination of these, you need to decide these logistical details ahead of time, because there'll be one less worry during your crisis response. The best way to alleviate stress during crisis response is to regularly test your plans, be it your automation, your step-by-step plans, or your communications. So now we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk a little bit more about testing. So we have to test like our business depends on it, because honestly, it does. Even those that have the strongest security posture or the most resilient system design, we can't rest on our laurels because of how quickly the cyber threat landscape evolves. Once more to our cyber resilience study, over half, 52% of our respondents said they have no set time period for reviewing or have never reviewed their response plans since putting them into place. This means they're not evaluating whether or not their plans need new sections, if they need to change their plans to address new threats, or they need to update them because of changing business priorities and operations. Like I said, organizations have to test their plans because our resilience, our livelihood does depend on it. Testing is important because we need to build muscle memory. Athletes practice their plays and their routines to build that muscle memory of what they need to do during the big competition or the big crisis in our case. We need to assess the maturity of our response programs and identify areas to improve in them. We have to also evaluate our organization's ability to meet our objectives, such as our recovery time objective and our recovery point objectives in business continuity. And it's just best practice. Look at any standard and tell me one that doesn't suggest that you shouldn't test your plans. Organizations also use a variety of testing methods to evaluate their preparedness in the event of a crisis. And no matter how you want to test, which testing method you use, you should start with defining your test objective. Are you testing your ability to recover, or are you testing the efficiency of your recovery process? Or are you testing your ability for different teams to be able to communicate during a crisis? Your desired objectives are going to define the type, format, and participants for your crisis response testing. One of the most common ways, and arguably the most useful ways, is doing tabletops to test your organization's response to realistic threat scenarios. On one end of the spectrum, you may have walkthroughs, which are lighter versions of a tabletop where the teams are assembled and literally walk through their response plans. On the other end of the spectrum, we may do failover testing or live simulation testing, where plans are tested with teams during the course of their normal daily activities to see how they respond under the stress of day-to-day operations when coupled with a crisis. And to take stress testing a step further, you may want to consider using disruptor analysis or even chaos monkey testing in order to understand your organization's ability to respond and recover from unpredictable threats, such as our black swans. You also need to make sure you test all of your crisis scenarios. Organizations have to consider testing scenarios that affect their workplace, their workforce, and the supporting information technology. Consider the black swans and the gray rhinos as you define your test scenarios. And I realize you cannot test all these scenarios at once. You need to establish probably a 1 to 3 year cycle that you can test a variety of your threat scenarios, including cyber incident response events, to facilitate a less chaotic response when crisis does strike. And at the end of each exercise, you should always perform a lessons learned activity to be sure to capture opportunities for both improving your crisis response plans as well as improving your testing program. The lessons learned activity is one way to measure your program, but let's continue on and discuss a little bit more about how we can effectively manage and report on our cyber resilience programs. As Peter Drucker is famously quoted for saying, "What's measured improves." Measuring the readiness and execution for any process or plan is essential to understanding if it's working as intended. Quite simply, you need to measure your cyber resilience program in order to manage it. Metrics will help us define success or failure and to be able to improve upon them. Within your crisis response or business continuity programs, we can measure and report on metrics for a variety of reasons. Most often, it's to provide a control and feedback loop on the readiness posture of our key business processes and applications and their resiliency. We also measure so that we can evaluate the effectiveness of the process and plans and to gauge improvement. Did the changes we made to that process, that plan, or that automation really drive the improvements we intended or to the extent we desired? When considering what to measure, you'll want to have metrics that measure your program's coverage of efficiency, but you'll also want metrics that illustrate the organization's readiness and ability to respond during a crisis. Some common program level metrics to consider are the coverage of your applications or your critical applications. How many have a business impact analysis? How many are covered by a business continuity plan, a disaster recovery plan, and even especially an incident response plan? What's your employee education completion rates? Are all employees educated on their roles as part of crisis response? Are they going to know what to do? You may want to report on the time since each plan was last updated. An out-of-date plan is not really a great plan at all. You may also want to look at the number of business applications or processes that are at risk of a particular threat or disaster. And last but not least, you also want to report out on the actions completed from your lessons learned activities. How many are completed? How many are in progress? Did you get funding for all of those that needed it? On the operational side, we talked about the importance of testing metrics to communicate your organization's preparedness. Again, are you able to meet your recovery time objective? Are you able to meet your recovery point objective? You may even want to consider your recovery time to actual objective, your RTA, which is the time that passes when your RTO is executed in the real world and all of the variables that entails. One more consideration for metrics that's arguably even more important than the actual metric outcome itself is who and how you share your business continuity, your cyber resiliency program metrics. I highly recommend you build out a dashboard of executive and operational metrics that will help your organization to understand how ready they are to be able to respond in the event of a cyber crisis. You want to put the metrics in context as they relate to your critical business processes and applications. And through clearly communicating your successes and your gaps, you'll be able to garner stronger support and possibly even additional budget needed to improve your cyber resiliency readiness. By giving your executives and your business leaders and even your board of directors quantifiable and context-based insights on your program, you're going to make it easier for them to support your goal of building your cyber resilience program and keeping the company alive. So I'm going to wrap this up here. Again, today, the goal we talked about for crisis planning is understanding the threats that face our organizations, whether they're black swans or gray rhinos. The goal is to be prepared. So when you hear the words, this is not a drill, you have the confidence in your organization's ability to withstand and respond to that crisis. Recall at the start of the session today, I discussed different types of threats that organizations need to plan for. The improbable black swans, the highly likely gray rhinos, and elephants in the room that we need to listen to, the Cassandras in our organizations who warn us of risk. A failure to plan is a plan to fail. With our organizations, we need to have clear plans to prepare for and respond to a variety of crisis scenarios, both in the physical world and the cyber one. We need to establish our dream team that brings together security, privacy, business, and technical leaders from across the organization. And where possible, we need to consolidate, automate, and integrate our tools to help us better detect, contain, and respond when crisis does occur. Lastly, don't forget to test and measure and communicate the outcomes of both your testing and real-world crisis response. As I've had told to me many times in my career, don't waste a perfectly good response. Hop on the back of that gray rhino and make sure everyone understands the impact that it can have on your organization and what needs to be done to prepare for it. Thanks for allowing me to share your time today. I look forward to hearing your questions and your feedback. Thank you.
Hey, Beth, that was fantastic. I'm so glad you mentioned the book Warnings by Richard Clark. I've read that book, and if you haven't read it, you need to read it. I actually use the Fukushima example all the time because there is a rock that is the high watermark that's been there for 1,000 years, and yet they ignored it. So the Cassandras is a phenomenal insight. So I had a few questions, if you don't mind. One is I actually do a lot of work with cyber physical coordinated events. So either a cyber event that leads to a physical incident, or basically a physical incident that detracts from the cyber incident. Do you find those to be more on the swan, elephant, or rhino side?
So I think that we are heading from them being swans probably into rhinos. When we look at, say, buildings today, buildings are built around technology. So we have a real world building situation, an elevator, a heating and cooling, a plumbing situation. In many cases, those are driven by IT systems. Those IT systems, of course, have security vulnerabilities and are vulnerable to attack and exploit. So, I think they've moved past swans and they're now becoming more and more common as rhinos.
Yeah, I know in the past we've called them IoT events, and I'm not a big fan of the IoT keyword. I like cyber physical because that is really the impact-based wording. The second question I had, when you're saying you're assembling your team and you obviously want teams from all different aspects of the business, I always look at things like what I call scaffolding events. So the downstream impacts. How and when should you include the teams for those downstream impacts? Do you include them at the tabletop level, or do you include them beforehand and try and pre-prepare them for the event?
Oh, I'm 100%. This is as early and often as possible. You need to bring all of those teams together. If you don't practice with, say, legal and HR or comms at the table, then you're not going to execute in the midst of crisis with them by your side. If you say, oh, we'll get to them, we'll bring them in when it's necessary. When it's necessary, you're going to forget, and you're going to not be responding with the full team engaged and having the benefit of practice and testing.
And my last question, So I can't tell you how many businesses, especially when I was a consultant, did not have run books and did not understand what a run book was. So for the businesses that are out there and the audience that's out there that has never understood what a run book is, where can they get started on how to figure out what a run book is and where to build, how to build one?
Oh, goodness. Good resources for a run book. Um, I'm not sure I have a great resource for that other than to say the run book literally needs to be your step-by-step
Yep.
plan, your step-by-step response. And I honestly think your run books cannot be too detailed. They need to include not only the actions, but who takes them. How long do you wait for them to be taken or not? What technology, even screenshots, can go into your run book to say this is what needs to happen by when and by whom? Because those run books are going to be your lather, rinse, repeat activity. They need to be autopilot. You need to be able to go through them even without them in front of you. And that's where automation comes in, because what you can do with a lot of the tools that are out there is automate those run books so that you aren't keeping the Word doc that somebody has printed off and in their desk drawer. You can just go into your tool
It goes
and follow.
obsolete as soon as you print it. Yes. Well,
Yeah,
hey, Beth, thank you for your time today. And look forward to talking some more.
great. Thank you for the opportunity.